Well, we got some wonderful news yesterday, as I'm sure you heard. Justice Kennedy's retirement is great, fantastic news. And I'm surprised by it. I admit that I'm surprised. I really figured that he would wait at least until after the midterms to retire so that he doesn't become the most hated man, um, in Washington, at least among the liberals and the media and so forth. But he did retire. And, I said as recently as yesterday, I had said that I don't think we're heading into a civil war in this country. And the thing that, in my mind, would prevent a civil war is that Americans are very lazy, and also you can't really get air conditioning and Wi-Fi on the battlefield. So I figured that would be kind of our saving grace that would prevent an actual war from taking place. But then Kennedy retired, and now we are looking at the very real, though far from certain, possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned and the phantom right to abortion being voided from the books. This, of course, would not be the same as outlawing abortion, by the way, and I know that this is probably really obvious to most of you, but some people seem to be confused on this point. To overturn Roe v. Wade is not to outlaw abortion. That would not outlaw abortion. To outlaw abortion nationwide would require probably an amendment, a personhood amendment or something like that. But a SCOTUS decision would be hugely significant. It would be one of the greatest moments in American history by far. Though it wouldn't be the end of the pro-life fight, it would actually be more like the beginning of the pro-life fight. The way that somebody on Twitter said, I thought they put it in a way that's very apt, I think. And he said that the overturning of Roe v. Wade would be like D-Day. Okay, so it's not the end of World War II. It is D-Day. It is like storming the beaches. Okay, here's when the real fight starts. And it's important for us to understand this. This is not me trying to downplay the significance of overturning Roe v. Wade. I mean, I would literally weep for joy if that happened. I would weep for joy for days if that happened. But what would then happen is that all the states would have the ability to outlaw it if they chose to. And so immediately upon this decision coming down, if it were to come down, abortion would still be legal in every state in the union, and then each state would have to go through and explicitly outlaw it themselves. And we know that there's a good chunk of states where that's just not going to happen. States like, California, New York, it's not going to happen there. But then there are other states where it could happen. And that's where there's going to be a real fight. Okay, that's where there's going to be a battle like you've never seen before. And that's where the culture war, I think, could bubble over into something like a real war. And it's just, you cannot understate or you cannot overstate the way liberals will react if their right to abortion is actually threatened. And this is not me at all saying, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do it because I'm afraid of how liberal. No, they will explode, perhaps literally in some way. And if that's the case, so be it. Because there is no price that is too high to pay when it comes to finally doing away with this historic atrocity. And so if overturning Roe v. Wade and beginning to actually outlaw abortion, if that did bubble over into violent hostility because the left just cannot handle it, then I say, so be it. So be it. This is what we have to understand. It's something I've been saying for a long time. I wrote a whole book on the subject, in fact. Abortion is the left's highest sacrament. That's what I call it. It's their high sacrament. It's the most important thing to them. It's the thing that is most central to their ideology and to their outlook on life. The modern left was really born with Roe. And it won't die with the overturning of Roe, but it will enter into a new phase, a phase that is even darker, more depraved, more wicked, and probably more violent than the phase that they're currently in. And there's a reason why abortion is so important to the left. We need to understand the reason. It's a very simple reason. Modern leftism is the worship of the self.
Well, welcome to another edition of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and I'm out for a drive today. And hope that you're doing well, and hope that the Lord is blessing you. And today we're going to be talking about a recent development in respect to the Supreme Court. As you know, if you're a Christian, you've been praying for the end of abortion. You've been praying for the reversal of the infamous Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion in all 50 states in 1973. That's been 45 years ago. And I remember as a college student in the late 80s that I was part of a pro-life group, and we would gather together and pray and do all we could to end abortion. And that was decades ago. And here we are 45 years later, and we still have abortion in our land, in all 50 states. And so every presidential election cycle, we pray that God would raise up a president who would appoint Supreme Court justices that would uphold the sanctity of human life. And sometimes we get those presidents, and sometimes we don't get those presidents, but it always seems to be the case, whether we get the presidents or not, that abortion remains. Whether it's a pro-life president selecting conservative judges, or whether it's a liberal president selecting liberal judges, the end result seems to always be the same, and that is that abortion on demand, no matter who you get as president, no matter who you pick as Supreme Court justice. For example, back in the 1980s, I remember very clearly the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, at the heyday of the moral majority. Jerry Falwell and others were encouraging, D. James Kennedy, some other people, high-profile evangelical leaders, were encouraging Christians to get out there and vote for a president who can appoint Supreme Court justices so we can reverse Roe v. Wade. That has been the strategy for at least 3 decades, if not longer. And so we got our first really important conservative president in Ronald Reagan. And guess what happened? Ronald Reagan appoints, as we know now, 2 pro-choice candidates, not pro-life judges, but pro-choice judges. His first appointment was Sandra Day OConnor, and the story behind that, I think, is told by Cal Thomas, who used to be a part of the moral majority along with Jerry Falwell. Cal Thomas tells the backstory on this, and that is that there was a conversation between Ronald Reagan and Jerry Falwell, because Jerry Falwell was very close to protesting the selection of Sandra Day OConnor, simply because he didn't know anything about her and he didn't trust her, and nobody seemed to know where she stood on abortion. And this is very important, because here you had the moral majority campaigning for Ronald Reagan and getting out the vote enthusiastically, sometimes maybe even crossing the line between Christian zeal and evangelism and zeal for politics. The moral majority has been accused of crossing the line and getting too political, too worldly, in the sense that they were obsessed and their heads were filled with thoughts of politics and winning back the culture over winning the people for Jesus and doing the work of the church. And so in their zeal, they got millions of evangelical Christians involved in politics to help win Ronald Reagan the presidency, and with the hope that he would appoint Supreme Court justices that would reverse Roe v. Wade, that would help purify our culture of all of this culture of death and stay the wrath of God, the hold off the wrath of God in our nation, because a child sacrificial system like abortion is certainly something that could trigger the wrath of God. If you read the Old Testament, you'll know that the Old Testament is filled with cycles like the people sinned and God sent judgment. The people sinned and God sent an enemy army to invade them. The people sinned and God brought disaster on the people. In other words, there's that cycle of sin and punishment all throughout the Bible. And if you read the Old Testament especially, you see that over and over and over again. And I'm reading the one-year Bible. I do so every year. Every day you have an Old and New Testament section of the Bible you read. I'd encourage every one of you to do that also if you are looking for a plan to read the Bible. And so the plan was, we get Ronald Reagan elected. He appoints pro-life Supreme Court justices. They sit on the bench. There's a case that goes before the bench on abortion. They reverse Roe v. Wade, send it back to the states. At least there can be some abortion-free zones in this country where the baby killing does not take place. And that was the plan all along. And other than the Human Life Amendment, which is ultimately the answer, but you have to work with what you have. And so all these Christians got out the vote to vote for Ronald Reagan, and we were all excited about it. And he picks Sandra Day OConnor, and he calls Jerry Falwell up and says, Jerry, I know that you're not really big on Sandra Day OConnor. You don't like her, and you're kind of tempted to object to it and protest and rally the troops against her. But Ronald Reagan supposedly said, according to Kel Thomas, trust me on this, you're going to like her, she's going to turn out good. You won't be disappointed. Just don't protest this. Let's get this through. Okay, so Jerry Falwell told all of his friends, don't protest her. I got word from the top, Ronald Reagan, that this is going to be a good nominee. She's going to turn out good. She's going to be on our side. Well, lo and behold, as the years have shown, Sandra Day OConnor consistently voted for abortion. Yes, for abortion. So Ronald Reagan, our candidate, our conservative, our hope, the one we voted for, he actually appointed a justice who worked for the other side, the culture of death. Okay, so if that's not enough, Ronald Reagan also has an opportunity to appoint another Supreme Court justice. Okay, so what's he going to do? We voted for him once, we voted for him twice, we re-elected him. Christians turned out to elect a conservative president so that he could appoint some conservative judges so that they could reverse Roe v. Wade, so that the hand of God and judgment could be stayed, so that we could hold back the judgment of God in our nation for the sins of abortion. So he picks Robert Bork as his nominee, who would have been a fantastic Supreme Court justice. But as you know, what happened was the Senate Democrats all got together, ganged up on Robert Bork, smeared him, did a media campaign, whipped up so much fear that eventually Bork had to drop out, and we get the phrase borked in respect to judges whenever someone is sort of railroaded out of the position because one side doesn't like him. So Judge Bork was rejected. He nominated another man. He was rejected because he, quote, smoked pot in college once or twice. Really petty things now. Finally, the last nominee, I guess Reagan was getting desperate. He wanted to get somebody there, so he gave us Kennedy, Justice Kennedy. the one who's retiring. And Justice Kennedy has been a disaster on abortion and family issues. And, for example, he wrote the majority on the so-called gay marriage decision that legalized gay marriage and overthrew the traditional definition of marriage. And so Kennedy is no friend of the pro-life community. He is no friend of the civil, moral society. He is a liberal. He is a progressive. On the important decisions, he votes with the liberals, even though on some of the minor decisions, he'll vote with the conservatives. So those were the two bad choices of Reagan, our guy, our conservative guy. But that's not where it ends. The next president, George H.W. Bush, another guy we voted for, another guy who was pro-life. Actually, George H.W. Bush came and spoke at my commencement at Wheaton College, and I willfully and gladly voted for George H.W. Bush because, again, the plan was he would appoint solid, conservative, pro-life, pro-family, pro-Christian, conservative judges, and we could get Roe v. Wade reversed. Well, it's even harder. It was harder because after Reagan's disastrous choices for Supreme Court. So you would have thought that Bush would have learned. We got to really be careful here because these judges can flip-flop. They can turn traitor on us, and we don't want that to happen. And notice it never happens that way with the other side. The liberal presidents never appoint stealth conservatives that turn out not liberal. All of the liberal Supreme Court justice appointees always stay true to the way they were chosen. If Barack Obama chooses justices, they stay liberal, radical leftists. It's only the conservatives whose judges flip side and turn traitor. And so you would think that George H.W. Bush would be very careful. I saw what happened to my predecessor, Ronald Reagan, so I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen to me. No, not at all. He appoints David Souter, another liberal, pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage. It's as if the Republicans can't even walk across the room. It's as if that they can't even do a simple task. So all of this energy and all of the resources and all of the money that Christians have invested in politics to try to sway the Supreme Court to reverse Roe v. Wade, all of these decades has failed. Well, lo and behold, we have a candidate who is the least likely to be connected with evangelicals under normal circumstances, Donald Trump. I voted for Donald Trump. I didn't like a lot of what I heard coming from him personally. I don't like his materialism and his love of money and his immoral lifestyle in the past and all these other things. Normally, I think most Christians would not even consider voting for somebody like a Donald Trump. But under these circumstances, yes, because these are not normal circumstances. So many of us, I think 80%, 85% of the evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. What has he accomplished? Well, already he has appointed a Supreme Court justice who is looking good so far, Neil Gorsuch. So we may have just almost enough votes if we get another pro-life justice on the court. We just might be able to reverse Roe v. Wade, actually strike it down, nullify it, get rid of it, throw it in the trash heap, burn it in the fire, put it in the dustbin of history. That's where that belongs. Roe v. Wade was an awful, terrible decision. It was the prime example of what happens when you have a judiciary that wants to intervene and make laws instead of sitting back and taking a minimalist approach that we do very little. A minimalist approach would be, we're not going to do much. We're going to try to stay behind the scenes. We're going to try to simply rule, okay, if this law is legit or not, if it's constitutional or not, but we're not going to get involved in the crafting of legislation. That's for the other branches of government to battle over. We are going to take a minimal approach, and that means we're going to stay out of the way, and we're going to try to make ourselves not as visible as other progressive activist judges try to make themselves. And think about Roe v. Wade. Harry Blackmun wrote the opinion on that, and he didn't just rule on a constitution. He created rights out of the Constitution that he found in the Constitution, created these rights, and imposed them on the country. In other words, he was enacting legislation from the bench. So what we want to see is a judiciary that doesn't craft legislation from the bench, but simply stays out of the way and lets the lawmakers pass laws, and only stirs itself when there's something that's unconstitutional, clearly unconstitutional. And so Donald Trump, at this point in history, has the opportunity to actually appoint a second Supreme Court justice. Now, remember this. Bill Clinton only appointed 2 Supreme Court justices in 8 years. He won re-election. So he won the election the first time, and then he won re-election. He appointed 2 Supreme Court justices. Barack Obama also appointed 2 Supreme Court justices in his 8 years as president. He won the first time, and then he was re-elected. Donald Trump, who the left hates and who the right, Christians, were and are and have been leery about, but has promised to be good to Christianity, he is all set to appoint 2 just in the first 2 years of his office. And he has the possibility of appointing even 2 more before the end of his first term. So this is a big deal. This is really big, because he has the potential, if he does it right, and the Lord God Almighty works this out, because it's in God's hands ultimately, he could appoint a pro-life judge in Neil Gorsuch. If he is a pro-life judge, we're praying and hoping that he holds to what Trump promised us. And he could appoint a second justice to replace Kennedy, who could be pro-life, and that would be enough, if abortion cases came before the court, to overturn Roe v. Wade. It's a really, really exciting time right now, because we have the potential to see a positive change after decades and decades of essentially defeat culturally. The latest negative, dark news that we got was in 2015, when Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion that changed the definition of marriage in the Bergethal ruling. And so it's been downhill for 2 or 3 decades as far as the moral victories we've seen in this nation. And one would be justified in saying there's no hope of ever seeing any kind of revival of morality or turnaround of the moral slide that we see, but here we have an opportunity now that we can actually see the Supreme Court change from being a predominantly leftist, far left, liberal institution to a conservative, pro-family, pro-life institution that will strike down some of these terrible rulings. And so we need to really, really begin to pray. I've been praying for 30 years for the end of abortion. Just as soon as I was able to understand what the crime was, I was aware of the fact that we have to end this. And it hasn't ended. And after 3 decades of praying over and over and over again, almost every day. And now we're on the brink of what could actually reverse Roe v. Wade. So I'm really optimistic. I'm really hopeful that this can happen, but we need to pray. First of all, we need to pray for a good candidate. We need to pray for a good appointment. Trump needs to send an excellent person before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He needs to send an excellent person. He needs to be totally qualified. He needs to have everything going for him. And then we need to pray for the senators, that the Republicans, who are majority now, would hold and stay faithful and loyal to that majority, and that they would not have any defect. And that even some of the Democrats who are bound to oppose this, some of them would turn and actually vote in favor of Trump's appointment. And then we need to pray that there would be no dirty tricks, procedural tricks, illegalities, and all kinds of other things that could happen that could derail this. And then we need to pray that this man that is selected and put on the Supreme Court actually is pro-life, and that they get a case before them that they can then dismantle Roe v. Wade. So that's our agenda for prayer in the next half a year. Join me, and we're going to pray, and we're going to get this done, and we're going to see God move mightily in our nation, perhaps to save it from itself. So with that, God bless. We'll see you back here in another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.